questions.
Welcome, Yamhill County, to Speaking Frankly. I'm your host, Howie Harkema, and our tagline is, "And how we doing?" Well, we're doing okay. We're doing okay. So my guests today are Jeff Clayton, who is running the First Baptist Church Winter Shelter, and also Reverend Erika Marksbury. Thank you both for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks,
for the
Howard.
invitation.
You're so welcome. So Jeff and Erika, could you please give us an overview of your winter shelter program?
Well, I think maybe there we could do an interviewee sandwich. I'll take a minute and say a couple of things about how, just the bare bones of how it works. And then we could maybe, if Erika's willing, could move over to her talking a little bit about where it came from, the kind of what begat what with this winter shelter, and how the relationship developed between FBC and YCAP, and a couple of things like that. And then I can step back in at the end and say a little about where we are now. So the winter shelter is the full name, the official name at the moment, after some rebranding last fall, is the Community Low Barrier Winter Shelter. All of which parts matter. It is a community resource. It is for the whole community, to serve the whole community and be served by the whole community. Both our neighbors at risk, our neighbors outside, and our neighbors who support them, who volunteer. We would like to see them drawn from the whole community, and our doors are open to everyone on both sides of that equation. It is a moderately sized shelter in the scheme of things. If any viewers out there know a little bit about those operations in any other parts of the valley, or over in Salem, where Arches, for example, has a network of warming shelters that do this kind of work. They've got about 4 or 5 churches in their rotation set up at different points in the city. We have the one, and so for that reason, we are a baseline community resource for McMinnville. We're sort of the floor in terms of assuring emergency shelter during hazardous weather this time of year, during the shelter season, which is more or less October to March. Not just this year, but most years. And we have about 3,500 square feet in the social hall, which is down on the basement level in First Baptist Church, which is, of course, a magnificent old shipwreck of a building. It's really 2 buildings, that wonderful old, strangely Spanish colonial part that is the original building, strangely here in Oregon. It would be just fine in Pasadena, but here in Oregon, it stands out a little bit. And the wing that was built on in the 1980s. This is over in the older part of the building, and it is the bulk of the downstairs footprint there. So we have a good sized space to work in, especially now under COVID. And we operate as a hazard shelter, which is to say, when the weather meets certain criteria that are harmful to people being outside, we open our doors. And I'd say that's kind of the bare bones of it. So I'll look to Erika for a minute about the genealogy of the shelter.
Sure. Yeah, we have what we have today, kind of on the heels of the CWISH program, which, Howie, you may be the best one to share the history of that. But CWISH was the Community Winter Inclement Weather Shelter, and it operated for, what, maybe 7 years?
8 seasons.
8 seasons here in McMinnville, and that was a shelter that rotated, like you were saying about in Salem, Jeff, that rotated between different host churches. Each church would host an opening for like as long as that inclement weather spell lasted, and then the cots and the volunteers and all of that would shift to another hosting location. When the Gospel Rescue Mission expanded their facility maybe 2 years ago, the CWISH program then folded for that winter. The rescue mission said, that they had the capacity to house all of the people who might have need in the area with the new facility. And so the CWISH program died down for a little while, but over the winter, when CWISH wasn't in operation, we kind of saw that not everyone was taking advantage of what was available at the Gospel Rescue Mission, and so there was still a need for a low barrier shelter. And so the next winter, we started back up kind of the CWISH model, except it was always hosted at First Baptist Church that last year. And then this year, YCAP started talking to us maybe late spring, early summer, saying, how can we support your efforts there? YCAP is really interested in helping to support and grow low barrier shelter options in the county. And so we said, well, what we could really use as a staff person especially just to recruit and train and organize volunteers. It worked that the shelter works because people are willing to come in and staff it and accompany people who need to be in and out of the weather. And so they got a grant, and through that we got Jeff. We got a shelter manager to help make all the little pieces happen.
Right. And at that point, in the words of Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you can tell Oscar I said that, Erika, enter me, he says in parentheses. There was now a task dedicated shelter manager who would be the paid on staff professional personnel for dealing with the shelter directly and expressly, the whole umbrella of what it needs to do and what needs to be done in order for it to function. And I came on board. I was the lucky guy out of the applicants, and I really mean that, who got to do the job. So now we have this relationship between First Baptist and YCAP, growing the shelter as a community-wide resource out of its base, its physical and its logistical and its sort of historical base, out of First Baptist into something that kind of envelops the community.
So Jeff, in your first year now, what are you learning from all of this?
I'm learning all kinds of things. It's a constant education. One of them I'm learning is that I am really, really lucky that I have had the somewhat twisty and convoluted path through careers in the job market I have, because boy, it sure pays to be a jack of all trades. Because being the person that might remind people of a certain age in the audience of some of those old TV comedy westerns where they go through the one-horse town and there's the one guy who's the judge and the sheriff and the innkeeper and the janitor and everything else. And for those sorts of things, when it must be done, that's me. So there is everything from public policy research to laundry to writing regulations to recruiting and training volunteers, public speaking, to repairing cots, to overseeing meals, to what amounts to a kind of non-professionalized casework in getting to know and be a support to our neighbors outside, to our guests, and also to the community of volunteers, the wonderful community of volunteers, without which I'd just be a guy with a title and no reason to get paid. Because without them, none of this happens. And we have a beautiful and growing community of volunteers. One of the other things I have learned, not to sound too whatever about it, although I am by nature a sentimental fool, is I have got a lot of time learning how wonderful so many people on both sides of this equation are. So many of our community members who come in and volunteer and do the work and support, how wonderful so many of our community members who we support are. That's I think my chief joy in this position. The thing that gets me up in the morning is there are so many good people on both sides of this equation. And I've gotten the chance to know that intimately doing the job. Another thing I've learned is this is always a ground level job. You are always in my position, right there where things are happening. The rubber is only ever on the road. Whether I'm working on volunteer recruitment and dealing with community organizations or other things like that, whether I'm coming in to help take down and lock up in the morning and checking in on how things are on both sides with volunteers or our guests, whether I'm working a shift myself just because I wanted to, maybe because I want to ride along with a new volunteer or because somebody had to drop out at the last second. Like a couple of weeks ago, we had one who's one of our real stalwarts, but his back went out on him at the last minute. And so I stepped in and took a shift. It's always happening. You're always at the point of contact, whatever the contact happens to be.
Well, you know, it takes a real Renaissance person to do the work that you do.
I don't know about that, but I've accumulated a lot of rather odd transferable skills in my time, or an odd combination of them. And so it was kind of kismet that got matched up with this job that's like, really? I'm going to use all of this stuff? That seems a little uncanny, that all of this stuff that I've just randomly kludged together trying to make a living actually applies here. So,
but I'm really glad that you're seeing the compassion of the community, because it is an outpouring, and I've got to witness it for 14 years. So I'm glad that you're seeing it too.
It's a beautiful thing. And as I say, it's reciprocity. I see it on both sides. It's a virtuous cycle. It passes back and forth between the people we support and the people who do the supporting.
So tell us about the grant that you guys got allowing you to operate this essential program.
That's really a YCAP story. We are just the recipients of it. Mandy Goff over at YCAP, she does a lot of work with this population. She coordinates a shelter collaborative meeting. She knew that we had operated kind of on a shoestring budget and just entirely with volunteers the last winter, and so she said that one of YCAP's priorities is low barrier sheltering, and she also said that they were more interested in coming alongside a community project that was already in existence than they were in reinventing something. I think because this church had been part of the See-Wish rotation for a long time, because out of this location we operate a breakfast on Monday and Friday mornings. You know, there are just a lot of ways that people who would be potential guests were already connected to this place. Right. And so it kind of made sense, I think, to her, maybe to others at YCAP, that we become that partner. So it means that things are a little more official than they used to be. You know, we used to have a sign-in sheet where we just took people's names and they kind of made a promise that they would be peaceful guests. And now there's some more paperwork involved because it's federal money, and so people are entered into a system. But hopefully even that system will be helpful in getting people more connected with resources that they need. So yes. I think it's a good thing for everybody involved.
That's fantastic. So Jeff, how do you decide or determine that a winter shelter event is necessary?
Our principal benchmark is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. 0 if you want to go north of the border. The Canadians would say 0, but 32 degrees Fahrenheit, that's our benchmark. And not merely 30 degrees on 32 degrees on the mercury, but the lived, felt experience, that kind of alchemy of dew point and pressure and other stuff. What is it like for a human body to be outside in these conditions? If that dips even farther, if that dips below, even if the mercury is a little, it shies just a couple of degrees north, that's still a condition in which we will say, really, we need to open our doors, because this is about the human experience. This is about the safety and the dignity and the comfort of our neighbors. Mm-hmm. So that's a guiding light. Of course, freezing precipitation conditions, that plays in there too. Maybe officially it's 34, but there's freezing rain and it's coming down in buckets. We're going to look at opening. If there was a real torrent, like a nor'easter back east, a a real torrential downpour and the temperature is in the 30s, per old-fashioned CWISH guidelines. A lot of wisdom in that CWISH manual. That we would definitely look at that and say maybe we need to open our doors, because again, it's about the lived conditions for the folks outside. 32 is the benchmark. That's typically what we look at and typically what drives us. But there are some related things.
Yeah, even wind velocity comes into that play.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Wind chill matters.
Yeah.
Yes, when you're vulnerable and outside and already living in an environment where trauma and deprivation are part of your life, that just magnifies all of those conditions. So we do that.
So how do you get the word out to the people who need to stay overnight at your winter shelter program? How do you do that?
We have a usual suspects list of people we automatically contact that ranges from the public library, where there's a lot of the public indoor interface between our neighbors outside and the sort of the institutional parts of the community. We get it out to 911, to MACPD, to Yamhill County Human Services, both at the top level there and also with some specific divisions, especially behavioral health and chemical dependency. And we get the word out to various local churches and some other civic organizations so that they know and can direct people. We've got on the property, we've got signs to put up whenever we open, so that people who move largely in the downtown area as they're outside can come by and see from different angles of the building that the sign's up and they know the shelter's going to be open in the evening. We are at work, just to sort of, previews of coming attraction, at work at trying to develop a more universalized signal that with some partners of goodwill downtown can develop into kind of a flag, just a kind of a symbolic. If you see this go up in the right windows in different places, then you know the shelter's open, which has the added advantages of it speaks to our neighbors who may be less literate or folks who have less English proficiency, because they don't need to deal with that. And also is a way to simply know, without having what for some of our neighbors can be traumatic encounters with authority, in order simply to find out what's going on.
So how many volunteers on an open night do you need in order to do the work?
The benchmark is 7. We have 3 shifts. We're open from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., 12 hours. We have an 8 to 12, a 12 to 4 graveyard shift, and a 4 to 8 that wakes things up in the morning, serves a breakfast meal, takes things down. There's also an evening meal in the evening. So that there are 2 food times where we're serving food to our guests in the evening as they're coming in, and then also first thing in the morning around, well, not this time of year, but as the light comes back around sunup, around say 6:45, 7 o'clock in the morning, so that there's some time to kind of compose oneself and get together and face the day before we start taking everything down to close up. We put 3 volunteers on the 8 to 12 shift, which is a little extra because sometimes there is, especially before I existed, not that I didn't exist before, but before my job existed, that a lot of the setup was done by the 8 to 12 shift. Now there's me, so I can get a head start on that, but also there are still sometimes details to get ironed out logistically right as we're opening up. So we have that third person as a kind of utility infielder. And the other shifts are 2 people each, the 12 to 4 and the 4 to 8. And typically these days also on the 4 to 8 by about 7:30, I'll come by to check in, see how the night went, see if I can do a little help to the folks taking down, so they can either focus more on the takedown while I focus on guests, or they can focus on the guests while I focus on takedown, and then lock up. So that's a logistical picture through the night.
So when you have 3 nights in a row, and you would need 21 people, are they the same 7 over and over, or do you need additional volunteers?
No, there is a mix. There is a mix. We have now, to my great joy and admiration, folks who will come in, and if there are multiple nights in a row, they will say either that they can do different shifts on different nights but contribute on each night, or that they're willing to pull the same shift on all 3 nights. But in the larger picture, that's a minority. That's a minority of the shifts getting filled. The larger picture is that we have a variety of volunteers, both who we need and who volunteer, in order to make things go.
We do have a big, we do have a pretty big pool of volunteers, which is
Yes.
which is really great. This year is especially complicated, right, because of COVID, which complicates everything. And so a lot of our volunteers who are retired or a little bit older are weary about coming in, or it's not safe for them to come in. And so trying to balance that reality of like, they really want to contribute to the program and see it succeed, and they have to protect their own health also. We have lots of COVID precautions in place, but the best advice is still just to stay home. So it's been great this year that, especially with Jeff's coming on, that we've expanded our pool of volunteers, which just gives us more options. But some of our volunteers from years past who right now are isolating more because of COVID have found other ways to contribute, which is also really beautiful, bringing in food or supplies or donating funds or just finding other ways that are safer for them, but that they can still be invested in the program. So that's been great to watch.
Just to go all church for a minute, it is that whole sort of St. Paul and the gifts of the saints. There are many different ways to volunteer. And we've been really lucky that our people are energized, even the ones who have to quarantine more strictly, that there are many different ways that they can contribute. Like Erika was saying, donating meals, they can donate supplies. Sometimes a good idea goes a long way. And they've been in this for a while, and they have some personal and institutional wisdom about it they can contribute. So, our whole volunteer community stays involved. But there is that sort of like the rings of a tree. It goes out from that core of shift volunteers who are on site into the people who do meals, the people who contribute supplies, to the people who do other things, who communicate or provide ideas or do other things to support. Yeah.
Well, the big question is, do you need additional volunteers to carry out your
Always.
Why, thank you for serving up that low-hanging curve. Yes, we do. We always need more volunteers on every facet and every level. And we've been very lucky with the ones that we have acquired during this shift season. We've got teams now of people who have been recent volunteers who are involved with meals. We've got younger volunteers who have recruited one another, have gone and made social media force for good by telling each other, hey, come on, do this great thing with me, who have done all kinds of things. One of my favorites of whom, their first shift ever, which I took with them because they were new, was a morning shift, and we were taking down cots, and some of our cots, while they have given faithful service back into Sea-Wish days, are what might be called lightly distressed vintage. And one of them had decided it wasn't going to work anymore, and this volunteer whipped out a little utility tool and fixed it. Wasn't even asked. I hadn't even noticed until the job was almost done. And here we had a cot that worked again, just because they rolled up their sleeves and dove right in there. And the more folks we have like that, the better, because then we don't overwork the ones that we have, and we've always got backups.
And if someone wants to volunteer, how do they get in touch? Who did they get in touch with?
At the moment, ultimately, they would get in touch with me. We are working on conduits through some local organizations so that there are sort of points of contact there also, where people who hear about this and are interested in volunteering, the word can reach back to me, or this person, whoever it is, the contact with the community group or institution, can be kind of an interlocutor and say, hey, Jeff, we got these couple of people who are really keen to volunteer. Can I give them your email, that kind of thing? I'm like, yes, please, right now. Why haven't you already? And then then we can get in contact and add them into the mailing list. So they get constant updates.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Erika. We'll come back to you in just a second.
Sure.
Jeff, would you like to give your cell phone number to the viewers?
Yes, I will do that. My direct line for this job is 503-719-2162. At
the end, we'll have you do that again.
Sure.
Now we'll go back to Erika. Erika, you were going to insert something wonderful, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say part of our not so secret hope with volunteers and with growing that that aspect of the work is that the more people that are involved with this project, the more relationships that are built, especially between guests and volunteers, and the more relationships that are built, the more the kind of urgency of the advocacy becomes.
Yes.
And so I just want to be clear, and I think Jeff would agree, the shelter is really, I think it does really important work. I think it does life-saving work, actually. It's also a stopgap measure, right? It's not anyone's ideal. And it's, it's feasible to continue, but it's not what we would hope for any of our neighbors ultimately. And so I just think the more people get to know people who live outside and see kind of those conditions and those needs and understand all of us as together in this, maybe the more we can be motivated to advocate for change at larger levels with the city, with the county, the more invested we can become in making sure that these people who are guests of the shelter, but also are friends and kind of just companions along the way, that we all have the dignity and the security that we deserve.
Yes.
We're all sojourners in the process for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know there's food available when they come in, and I know there's food available for breakfast. Would you like to explain how that occurs?
That is more of our wonderful volunteers, especially the folks who are in a more COVID cautious situation these days, which we can do a couple of ways. The ones who are more comfortable with it can deliver and also pick up utensils and pans and trays and other things in which the food's provided. Or in other cases, I or a couple of our volunteers can do kind of a reverse DoorDash. It's a reverse Grubhub. We pick up the food from them and then bring it into the shelter. And then, of course, make sure everything gets washed up and squared away and then makes its way back to them. So that is a vital part of volunteering. It is as important to have those people as a piece of the operation as it is to have the shift volunteers, because the food matters. This is about refuge, not just shelter in the generic sense of getting out from the rain, but it's about refuge and peace and respite and a little bit of community.
Right.
Just as Erika said, there's some communion in this too.
So in the program, on average per night, how many people do you see that are houseless?
That can vary. That has gone up. I'll use two data sets here. Since I came on right around Thanksgiving, that next week, going from November into December, we were open the longest time that any low barrier shelter in this town's been open since at least that hard winter in 2013-14. We were open 5 nights in a row, which was miraculous and all about the sheer quality of our volunteers. During that time, we averaged just under, it's one of those 10-point things, just under 11 guests a night. Now, inside the immediate shelter space, inside the dedicated, designated space in that 3,500-foot social hall, we have capacity during COVID conditions to house about 16 people. With some heights of creativity in a desperate situation where it would not be okay to turn away at least a few more people who showed up at the door, we could probably get it up to about 18 or 19 using a couple of other spaces, but that is max.
Right.
So we were running at just under 11 then. The last 4 times we've been open, we were open 2 nights during Christmas week and the week of the 25th, and 2 nights the following week, which for those of us who like a 12-day feast is still Christmas, but it's the next week. And during that time, our average was 14. 2 nights we topped out at 16. So that's an increase of about a third over what we were seeing at the beginning of the month. And these were significantly more serious nights in terms of the temperature got down to real levels of cold for here. There was some, if you were in poor health, if you were dealing with the cumulative health costs of that underserved, traumatized state, there could be real danger. So we saw larger crowds and more guests. How that will pan out as we go forward is probably determined by several factors, but we've already seen a big jump just in the last month.
Do you need donations of other things such as blankets, sleeping bags, those types of things?
We, thanks to a line item in the grant, we are in a good situation on blankets. And we are in the process of, to use a nice old-fashioned word, reinsuring our situation with sleeping arrangements to make sure that we have bedding for our folks in the longer term, and sort of dealing with the transition from our vintage, lightly distressed cots to make sure that people have a safe, stable place to be that's not the floor while they're in the shelter. Other things, socks are always very useful. There are a variety of sort of minor but crucial care items like that. Those sort of fundamental things when you think about what you most need but don't think of. Socks, classic example. Gloves, other things like that are especially important. We're happy to take sleeping bags, and we do have some reserves of that. But especially those small care items, those little things that assist not being worn down by discomfort, and that really also assist dignity. Those little niceties that make us feel a little bit more human are magnified for our folks. So yeah.
So we have 3 minutes left. I have 2 questions, and the first one is, how can the community assist in this very important program?
Well, they could make us obsolete. That would be awesome.
We're working on it.
To borrow for a minute, one of the great joys of my job, one of the many, is that I have a boss who can say it all much more effectively in about 1/8 the time than I do, which would be Erika. But there's that. They could make us obsolete. We could take a real proactive, integrated housing first approach and make this not necessary or simply an emergency adjunct, just like the ER room in a larger hospital that does so many other things than handle emergencies, and rather than the front and center baseline of how we deal with these issues in the community.
Well, it's a wonderful Band-Aid, though. It's a wonderful Band-Aid.
It is a wonderful Band-Aid. I love this Band-Aid. I believe in this Band-Aid. This Band-Aid serves good people and is served by them too. But that would be great. In the meanwhile, volunteering, advocacy, awareness, spreading the word, realizing the different ways over time in which just little things out in the community can matter. One of the most precious human resources is dignity. One of the most precious human qualities is kindness. And the more we have of both of those, especially for our most vulnerable neighbors, the better off we all are.
I've got one last question, and it's for both of you, and you each have about 25 seconds. Tell us personally how you feel about the work and the success of keeping our houseless neighbors safe.
I'll let Erika go first.
Erika?
I think it's one of the most important things we can do. I mean, I think we are all here to take care of each other, and by by whatever luck or circumstance or choice, none of that really matters. Maybe some of us have ended up with secure housing and some without. And to think that you could give 4 hours of your night, and maybe you could catch up on that sleep later, but it means that someone else doesn't stay out in the cold when that cold could be life-threatening. That's, that's a really important way to give of your time.